So good afternoon and welcome to our accessibility session on creating equations. One of the things we want to help you with is to know that to create something that's accessible at the start is much easier than going back and remediating it. But in order to do that, you need to know how to create it accessibly from the start. So Paige is going to talk to you about how to create accessible equations. So Paige, all yours.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and let me share the right screen. It's always a challenge on a Monday. All right, screen one. Go.
And post your questions in the Q&A at the bottom. And for those who like to read along, you might need the More button, and then you'll see CC for closed caption, and you can read along while Paige speaks.
All right. All right, so here we go. So welcome, everyone. I am Paige Durham, like Sherry said. I am the VCCS accessibility provider, which means my job is to support all 23 colleges as we work towards meeting those DOJ accessibility requirements. Today, we're going to spend 1 hour on that topic, which I think is kind of overlooked when we're talking about problems and accessibility in higher education, and that's math equations. And I want to say up front, you do not need to be a tech person to follow this session. You don't need to know anything about accessibility, but you already do. And so hopefully you'll be able to kind of get the idea. And we're going to talk about several different things. So in the next hour, we're going to cover you'll know about image-based equations and how that can create a significant barrier for your student. You're also going to understand and know how to use the equation editors that are built into the tools that you work in every day. And then we're going to talk about Gemini and Copilot as AI partners to convert equations that you already have saved as those images. And the last part is my favorite because it's fast. We're talking under 2 minutes per equation. One principle drives everything we do in this work. If you create it, you are responsible for making it accessible. That's not to mean that it's punitive. It's actually very empowering. It means accessibility in your hands, and you get to choose exactly how to do things on your time. So that's what we're going to start with. So this is the problem. So I want to start with this because this is kind of the heart of everything. The left of your slide that you're looking at is a beautifully formatted quadratic formula. Looks great, right? But you put it in your course, your notes, your slide deck. It's clear to you. It's clear to most of your students. But look at the right side. That's what a student using a screen reader hears when you save that equation as an image and drop it into your content. That's it. That's all they get. Image underscore 0047.jpg. Not the formula, not the variables, not the structure, just a file name if they're lucky. And sometimes it just says image. Every single piece of mathematical information in that equation is completely invisible to the screen reader. Every fraction, component, symbol, gone. The student has no idea what the equation says. I want to let that sit with you for just a second because this is not hypothetical. This is happening right now in courses across our system. Students are sitting in calculus, chemistry, statistics, reading along, and the course hitting a wall every time a formula appears as an image. And they have no way to tell you because they can't even describe what the image is because they can't see it at all. So that's what we're going to be fixing today. Where does this happen? Well, everywhere. It's not just a Canvas problem. It's I need to fix this in my Canvas content. And Canvas is very important, but it also shows up in Word documents that you attach as assignments, PowerPoint slides that you upload as course files, PDFs that are generated by either of those, Google Docs or Google Slides, screenshots of textbook problems, photos of whiteboard work you took in class and then uploaded. So anytime an equation is saved as a picture, rather than created with an equation editor, it becomes a barrier. The really good news is, and that's why I'm genuinely excited about this workshop, is that every single one of those platforms has a built-in solution. You already have the tools, you just might not know exactly where they are. No new software, no budget requests, no IT tickets. Oh, that's like a triple, what do they call it in a trifecta. That's it. That's a trifecta win right there. So Word, PowerPoint, Google Docs, Slides, and Canvas all have equation editors built right in. When you use those editors, instead of inserting a picture, the platform automatically creates output that a screen reader can interpret. The tool does the accessibility work for you. You just have to use the right feature. That's the whole session in one sentence, honestly. Use the equation editor, not a screenshot, not a photo, and not copy and paste from somewhere else, the equation editor. Now let me show you where to find it in each platform. Before we get into the how-to, I want to show you the contrast one more time, because once you hear it, you'll never forget it. Look at these two examples. Image-based equation, the screen reader says image.equation.png dead end. Accessible equation built with an equation editor, the screen reader reads x equals fraction negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac end square root over 2a end fraction. That is the complete equation, every element. The student hears the full mathematical structure announced clearly and in order. They can engage with it, they can write it down, they can learn it. Once announces a file name, the left side of the screen announces the file name. The other side actually teaches math. That's the difference, and it's entirely within your control. So the first thing we're going to talk about now is Word, because I know a lot of you live in Word. Finding the equation editor is simple. Insert the equation, that's it. You will get a visual editor with tabs for fraction, exponents, radicals, integrals, and all of the symbols you could ever need. When you use that editor, Word creates accessible output automatically. You do not have to do anything extra. The structure is built in. Now let's switch to Word. Well, yep, there it is. So, sorry, one of the many windows that I currently have open, and I needed to find it. Let me make sure I am now sharing Word. Yep, okay. All right, so we're looking at obviously a blank document. So the first thing we're going to do is I want to let you know that this is the most recent version of Microsoft Word. And when you're doing some things, you need to make sure that you understand the difference between using the Word app, which is a downloaded program on your computer, versus Office 365 and in Word. You may be limited to some of the things that you find in the ribbon at the top of Word if you are in the online version of Word in the Office 365. Okay, so up here at the top, you see I have all of that's my normal ribbon, but I'm going to go to the second tab, or actually that's the third tab because File is the first, and you're going to click on Insert. Now, once you get to that, you're going to find where it says Equation, which is right over here. And now you have some options. So you can use the virtual templates, and I'm just going to click on fractions. So you can see if I scroll down a little bit more, we have lots of different things. And there are even more equations that you can find by clicking in the world icon at the very bottom. That will allow you to find many, many, many more equations that are templates that you need. So let's just click on as you can see, there's tons here. And of course, if you know and you understand how to do these, you can, there is also an insert a new equation option at the bottom. Where is just a simple? Nothing is ever simple. Oh, there we go. All right. So now I just clicked on the quadratic formula. So you can see here that I have options. Up here you have all of the symbols that you need. You have the fractions, which will give you different ways of viewing the fractions. You also have your script, all of the tools that you need. Once you click on equation, and notice that it even adds an equation tab at the top, so that if you need a different kind of equation, you can simply click on that and you're still in the equation editor, but now you know it's going to be written the right way. And you can see that there is also a drop down within that. And what you can see now, that this is now a perfectly acceptable equation. So if I hit enter, it's going to move to the next line. So if I wanted to go to another template, let's say, and I want to go again to a new equation. Of course, I taught music, so this is a little bit out of my realm of understanding. So you be patient with me. We only had to count to 4 when I taught music, you know. Well, just insert a new equation. Okay, so now if I want to type in, this is a brand new equation, and I want to put in, let's put in square root, that one. And we can put in oh, nope, that's the wrong box. I don't know why Grammarly's on today. There's still one. So now I can, again, you just put the equation in, you type it, it's rendering, it's easy. And every single piece of this is acceptable. And a screen reader is going to read it exactly the way that it should be read. So if you are building in Word, then as long as you are using the equation editor, whatever you put in your equations is going to be, it's going to be accessible to a screen reader.
Paige, I'm going to ask you a couple of quick questions, and you can always say, I'll get to it.
Yep.
Documents created in LaTeX, are they accessible?
Yes. LaTeX is accessible.
Okay. One person says they don't have an equation editor in their Word doc, which I think we have to look at a separate time, but they use, oh, you and I looked at this once, EQUATIO.
Yes, Equatio.
Does that offer accessibility?
Yes, it does. And I
This
believe
one,
it's free.
this one you may not know. Does it have electronic equations?
Yeah, I don't know about that.
I don't know what that one means, so we will get you an answer.
Yes,
And
we will. Yeah.
if you use the handwritten equation to typed, does that feature make an accessible equation? I don't quite know how they do that. So we're going to get back to these.
Say that. Yeah, I'll have to think about that one.
We'll get back to those two. Okay,
Yeah.
keep going.
So if you're in a course and you're making documents, build your equations first in Word. And Word is your best starting point for anything you plan to share, print, or export. There it is, to PDF. So we'll come back to the PDF export question in just a little bit. All right, so let's keep on going. So that, oh, there we go. Let's make sure that it actually did what it was supposed to. So, and again, we will talk about saving as a PDF. So PowerPoint, same thing. It's the same engine as Word, same location, insert then equation. If you put equations in your lecture slides, and you probably, many of you do, this is where you make that switch. Instead of taking a screenshot of an equation from somewhere else and dropping it in, you open the equation editor. Now, I'm going to stop here for just a minute because I had a conversation with someone from Nova, and there was a publisher. Yo, I'm going to say it's McGraw Hill, but don't hold me to that. That uses, so this is what happened. The publisher said that the PowerPoints that they gave you, the publisher created PowerPoints, were accessible. Problem: they used a tool that we do not have access to called Math Type, TYPE, Math Type. And the problem is when you look at the PowerPoint without having the tool Math Type, the equations are not accessible anymore. They now have bizarre characters. They're wrong. So here's the issue, and this is a Sherry issue kind of question thing. Yeah, sorry. But so the publisher has said that they've given us accessible PowerPoints, but only because they used a tool that is extra money that we don't have access to. I personally feel that that is very problematic and that publishers should not be allowed to use a third-party tool that is extra. There's no way around that. I did everything literally under the sun to try and get around the Math Type plugin in PowerPoint to make the PowerPoints from that publisher accessible, and I couldn't do it. I mean, I tried everything except for remaking the PowerPoint using artificial intelligence, and then it was accessible. But I don't feel that faculty should be asked to remake a publisher's PowerPoints because they're using a third-party tool that we don't have access to. But I'm going to leave that right there for not my, that's way above my pay grade. But I do want to bring that up because I know that is a problem, and I know that it has been a problem, and that it may be a conversation that shared services needs to have with the publishers and say, hey, you all can't be adding in these fancy third-party tools that cost extra money when you are making your materials accessible for faculty. But that's all I'm going to say about that. Unless you want to add anything.
If you have that situation, you do need to ask the vendor in an email and then save their answer, because documentation is really important when we have something that we have done the best that we can, but we're not able to make it accessible. It is a last resort. It only buys you time. It doesn't protect you forever. But if you have an issue, you reach out to the vendor in an email because it's got to be documented, and you save their answer. And then you let me know, and Paige and I will cry with you.
Yeah. So I did want to bring that up because I do know and that is a current version of the PowerPoints from the publisher. That is the most recent version that has that third additional add-in tool in PowerPoint. So now, before we move on from PowerPoint, because it's exact same of Word, I'm not going to open that. But I do want to make sure that I bring up a few things when you're in PowerPoint. Before you export that file, make sure you go to review and check accessibility. That's both in Word and in PowerPoint. And it's going to flag any issues that remain. When you're ready to make a PDF from the PowerPoint, you're going to remember to save it as a PDF that preserves the structure and the tags. So if you're comfortable with the Word demo, and if you need me to, I will go over the exact save part at the end if you need me to. But for now, I'm just going to kind of move on. So Google Docs. So some people prefer to work in Google Docs because it's much easier to share in Canvas that way. You can either embed it, you can put it as a link. If you are using, and you should be using, the VCCS version, then you have Grackle, then you can check it, and then you know that the document is accessible. So I do want to pull up, and that's kind of one of the things that I want to talk about. So when you are, and you want to share, if you do have Google and you're using Google and you want to export it as a PDF, that's when you're going to use Grackle. All of you have access. It's free. It doesn't cost anything as long as you are in your VCCS account. If you don't, or you haven't found Grackle yet, we'll go over that in just a second. So for very complex equations, Google Docs built-in editor has some limitations compared to Word. So if you're working with advanced notation, Word may give you better control. So in Google Docs, let me again find the right window, because that's always a challenge when you have 17,000 open. Here we go. All right, so again, we're in a blank Google Doc. We're going to go to the insert. And again, it's still going to be equation as soon as I find it. Oh, wait a minute. It's under symbols. So first of all, note that in case you're now when you do that, you can see up here at the top, you have some Greek letters, you have the expressions, and I'm not going to use any more math terms because that just exhausted all of my vocabulary. But you can see that it brings up a little toolbar once you click on equation. So I didn't want you to miss that because that's actually very easy to miss. So if I wanted to do something like a simple equation, so x, oh, wait a minute, why is this not working? There we go, sorry. Oop. Now, once you type that in, and I know that's itty bitty, there we go. Maybe that's a little bit better. You can see that the output is accessible and it's going to be read the right way. Now, let's talk about Grackle for just a second. So Grackle is the extension that's going to check for accessibility. Because it is an extension, it is considered an add-on, and it is already in your Google Doc Sheet slides, all of that. You're just going to go to Grackle Docs and click Launch. Once you launch Grackle Docs, I know I clicked it, you're going to have another little panel pop out on the left. So we'll wait for a second because there's not here. And now you can see there are a few things that it brought up. Obviously, I didn't have any headers, so that's a problem. But what I want to bring your attention to is the export to PDF. That is really very key when you are in Google and you want to export to PDF. You cannot use the native file download PDF option because that is going to strip all of the tags and your PDF will become inaccessible. So you're just going to use the export to PDF. And that's going to do a couple things. So it's going to start by adding a progress monitor, and then it's going to submit the request. And now you can see that the document is uploaded to my drive, but I can also download it or I can view it. So it automatically saves to your Google Drive, your VCCS Google Drive, or you can download it. So just want you to know that it doesn't automatically download. It gives you the both options. It's going to keep it for you, and then it's going to allow you to download. And of course, obviously, when you click on download and then you open it, it's going to open correctly. All right, so moving on. Back up here. So now in Google Slides, it's the same thing like PowerPoint. Google Slides works the exact same way. You're going to insert symbols, equation, and I will stop for just a minute. because it is slightly different in your in Google Slides. So I'm actually going to insert a new slide. All right. So, but again, if you want to do the PDF and you want to have it exported, it's going to be the same process. You're going to make sure that you use the Grackle PDF export and not the native Google download as option. That's what's going to keep your PDF accessible, and you won't have to redo the PDF. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and move to Canvas. So Canvas already has a built-in solution, and this is probably where a lot of you are already thinking. However, you may not be thinking that exactly, but you have a couple options. So Canvas is where you want the students to spend most of their time, and Canvas has its own equation editor that is built directly into the rich content editor. And that is at the top of anytime you edit a page. And it doesn't matter whether it's a page, assignment, an announcement, a quiz question, a discussion post. The rich content editor exists in all of those things. What makes Canvas a bit more powerful is that it uses something called Math Jax, J-A-X, and Math ML, which is kind of what runs behind the scenes. You don't really need to know what those are, but it means in practice that is the equations that you create in Canvas render beautifully on every device, whether it's desktop, tablet, mobile, and screen readers will interpret them completely and correctly. So Canvas does all the heavy lifting for you. So you can work in two ways in Canvas, the visual editor, or you can work in LaTeX, which I believe we just had the LaTeX question earlier. So let's go to Canvas. Yep, there's okay. And I'm just going to go ahead and start a new page. So I will build a new page. I'll give it a title. Add item. And find it. It's always at the bottom. I did click. It's loading. I'm a little impatient. Actually, I'm a lot impatient, but that's okay. All right, so from here, I'll click on edit. And now we're in the edit mode, which is where we need to be. I'm going to close my City Labs tool because we don't need that right now. So this is the rich content editor. That's what this business at the top is called. If you ever have questions and you need help, and this is where you're going to find what you need. So from here, you're going to click on Insert. And here you have Equation from the drop down that's at the top in the insert. So once I open this, you have some options. You have several tabs. You have Basic. And then if you want to, you can turn on directly edit the LaTeX. So if you already have it in LaTeX, you can put it in here this way, and then you can edit within Canvas. So again, you have all your tabs here at the top. I'm going to turn this off for just a second. And now I'm going to click on just the fraction. And you see that a little placeholder. And then if I type in 3 and then 4, I now have a fraction. Now that's really hard to see because it put it in a lovely dark black on black, right? So now if I go back, I can see that's a lot easier to see once I enter the fraction. So now if you want to see what it looks like, if I go to the HTML, let me back up one quick hot second. So if you are curious as to what is happening in the background, the HTML editor is the greater than and less than signs at the bottom of the window of the rich content editor. and you can go here. So here you can see it is giving the latex, and that's what's going to be read by a screen reader. So even though visually we see 3/4, the screen reader is automatically going to read this correctly because of what's in the HTML. And that is MathML as well as LaTeX. So I didn't have to write any code to do this correctly. So now if I wanted to, and I want to put something in that is a little bit more difficult. So if I go back to insert equation, and I want to put directly in LaTeX, and I'm cheating because I already had this saved somewhere. So now if you notice, it shows you exactly what's going to be viewed in Canvas under the little preview is under this little directly edit in LaTeX. So now if I click done, now you can see that that renders exactly correct. So it rendered the full formula as it was typed, and that's live. So, and there it is. And now when a screen reader, again, if you want to see what it looks like, when a screen reader gets to this, it will announce x equals fraction negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac in square root over 2a in fraction. Every single element is going to get read, and it knows that because of this LaTeX tag that's right here at the beginning. So if you aren't sure about LaTeX and you don't understand, and most of you do, then you don't have to worry about that. You can do it using the other kind of editor. So so you just saw both options in Canvas, but a quick recap. So the visual editor is great if you're building an equation occasionally, or you want more familiar point and click experience, and you don't want to learn anything about the syntax. LaTeX is faster once you know a few common patterns. And honestly, if you ever want to learn LaTeX, you can just have AI generate it for you, and you don't actually have to learn it. Which is what we're about to cover next. So both are fully accessible. You just pick whichever one fits your personal workflow. Not that you have to change anything that you're doing. What I want to make sure that I give you some options. So I know now some of you are thinking, you have like 3 years worth of course content. I have equations saved as images that I took in my class when I was finished. I have them everywhere. I do not want to rebuild any of this from scratch. And I completely understand that. And the answer is you don't have to. This is where Gemini and Copilot, your generative AI tools, can look at an image of an equation that is handwritten and convert it to text or LaTeX in seconds. You're not having to retype anything. You aren't having to pull the equation, insert all of that down. You're just able to do that. And it takes about, I don't know, 2 minutes. Okay. So let's try this in Gemini. So let me get 1 second and get my Gemini open. And just need to use it. Let's use this one. All right. I am going to take an example that has both written text and handwritten text on it. And I'm going to put this into Gemini. I'm actually taking oh, nope, that's not what I wanted. Sorry. 1 second. My snipping tool didn't want to snip. Go.
We are looking at the slide.
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
fine. I just wanted to make sure you knew.
well, I'll show it to you. I mean, it's fine. This is what I'm going to take a screenshot of. And so I'm going to use my snipping tool on my computer. I'm not saving the file as anything special. And now I'm going to, well, if it decides to let me do this, there we go. Now I have it saved. Now I'm going to go back to Gemini. And all I did was paste in that. It's just literally a screenshot. Nothing complex, nothing, no big deal, right? So I'm going to ask it to convert this equation to latex code compatible with Canvas LMS. Do not include dollar signs or display, blah, 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 just the raw latex. So I'm going to go ahead and click on submit. Yeah, it didn't give me everything. I'll try again. Oh, that's better. All right, so you can see that took not a lot of time, and it did exactly what it was supposed to. So now what I can do is I can copy this, and you have a couple options. So you can copy the response, or you can highlight it and do it this way. So for the purpose of this, I'll just do it the old-fashioned way. Now I'm going to go back over to Canvas. I'm going to use the insert, the equation, put that directly in there, scroll down, and we're taking a look, and it looks right to me. Click done. And now you can see, there it is. So I didn't have to do anything. Oh, so all I did was get that information. Now you do have a couple of other options.
But
If
I have a question before you move on.
yeah,
So when we do all these different ways of writing out our equations with the equation editors, with generative AI and all these, visually to a sighted person, it looks like what the equation should look like.
correct,
Also, a screen reader can read it.
correct,
Okay.
correct. So visually, you should not see anything different. But if you want to know what's going on in the background and you really want to get into things like all of this, okay, then you feel free. But this is the HTML. This is what the screen reader is going to actually, it's in the metadata. It's not anything that we see visually. It's what's in the background, which is why if you are running like a you do it scan and you come across something that says your document or your PowerPoint or PDF or is missing a title, the title is not what's visually on the page. The title is actually what it's looking for is in the metadata, which is actually in the background, and it's in the code itself. So that's just kind of, for your information so that you understand. But what I want to emphasize is that you can still edit and you can still, and as the expert, content area expert, you are the person responsible for making sure that whatever the AI did is exactly correct, and you verify it before you publish it and you give it to students. This is just a shortcut to help you get from a handwritten image in order to get it into Canvas so that it is accessible. Now, I do want to bring up a few other things while we're here. Now, the question is it in this Canvas course or a different one? Who knows? Okay, so I'll explain what this is. So this is an example, again, like a screenshot of some handwritten homework from an engineering class. However, that handwritten homework was not accessible. So what I asked, and you notice that there's some issues down here at the bottom, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I actually asked AI to write all of the HTML for me, but it didn't do it exactly correct because I didn't give it the accurate information. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close that because it's not what I want. I'm going to go to the HTML and I'm going to, if you want to know how to select all, that's Control A. That selects everything. And then Control C is copy. Now I'm going to go back over to Gemini. If I can find the right window. And I'm going to say, this HTML is not rendering correctly in Canvas. Oh.
If I had pasted it into a Word or PowerPoint and it didn't look right, can I do the same thing in saying that it's not, say the same thing and say it's not rendering correctly
Yes.
in Word? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So now I gave it that, and I'm just going to hit the now. So it's kind of giving me this is why it did that. And now I'm going to go ahead and copy the code. I will go back to Canvas. Oh, nope, not yet. Sorry. Make sure I take you with me. All right. Now I'm going to Control A and I'm just going to delete all of that. And then I'm going to Control V. Now, if I go back to the other, that's still not right. All right. So now I'm going to, now, so that's 2 times. So I give it 2 tries and then we go somewhere else. So let me go over to my other friend. His name is Claude. And I'm going to tell him the same thing. This code does not render correctly. Claude is sometimes actually it's a whole lot better at coding than anything else. But you can try again, it's going to tell me exactly what it did and why. It's just going to take a minute. He thinks a little bit slower than some of the rest. Also, if you are coding and you are doing, we'll call them fancy things, please understand that Canvas will remove JavaScript and CSS. So sometimes you have to tell your generative AI that you are working in Canvas and it strips JSS and CSS, and CSS from Canvas. So now it's going to show me a preview of what it should look like in Canvas. And again, at the top, and it's telling me also, here's it says that one thing to confirm. So we're going to go ahead and once I switch to the HTML version, I can use the copy option at the top. Oh, sorry. I switched and didn't tell you. I apologize. All right, now I'm in Canvas. And here's the HTML that I copied. And now if I go to the back to the regular way to view this, now you can see that it is written correctly. Minus the red underline things that's Grammarly trying to tell me something else. So ignore the red underlines. But so now you can see that that's how that has been done. So now I can save it. And now we know that it is accessible for a sighted user and for someone who is using a screen reader. Now, I also want to take a minute and show you if you are doing something that where you want to keep that handwritten image and you want to add a text accessible version. Okay, so here we have exactly what I just said to you. So this is the first screenshot that we looked at earlier. But let's say I want to keep this in my course because I feel it's really important for the sighted users. But I also want to make sure that I have an accessible version. So this is what we see here. Now we have both a image and the correct HTML that is accessible to a screen reader. For the alt text for the image that is added, what you would say is handwritten math equations, accessible version found below. And that's all you have to say. And now you have the best of both worlds. So that's a way that you can keep your image. Now, there's another way to do this as well. So here you can see I did it a little bit differently. So in Canvas, so we have Project 2 key handwritten. So now you can see this. It's completely handwritten, right? And we want to keep that. But now we also have to provide a text-only accessible version. Notice that I said text only, but this version is accessible and would be used by a screen reader to walk through the entire thing. So I could either, I want to emphasize, I kept the handwritten because it has the figures in it that are important. If you cannot see a figure, then the figure does not need to be in the text only version. It has to be a written description of the figure. So that's why we have both the handwritten and then we have the text only version. And again, I did have artificial intelligence give me this text only version. And notice here, this graph description, that's the key difference. So because math has figures, and if those figures need to be described, that's why I'm giving both versions, the handwritten version as well as the text only accessible version. And it's really important that you label it as, as such. So, all right, back to my slides. So that's kind of an AI workflow. So I'm going to give you the slides so that you have all of this information that you can use as a reference later. There are some prompts on here that you can use. Notice that it has for handwritten work. You can transcribe this handwritten equation to LaTeX, or you can tell it to use it and make it accessible for Canvas LMS and meeting the WCAG 2.1 AA compliant standards. So now that's the easiest way, I think, to do any of this if you have documents that you already know that you are using. So again, you can use Gemini, you can use Copilot, you can use Claude. However, if you're using Claude, please remember it is not a VCCS purchased product, nor will it be purchased. There is a free version that you can use. But you will find that you may run out of credits, but your credits refresh every 5 hours. So also, if you want to use it, and I just found this out last night. There's a world of difference in the time of day when you decide to use any of these generative AI. Claude works great between the hours of 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. So if you happen to be with somebody who doesn't maybe sleep, that might be the time that you want to give it a whirl. So that's kind of a little prompt, a few prompts that you can use that are on the slides. And then again, if you are struggling with anything, you can also use generative AI to give you the alt text for an image if you want to put the alt text in rather than an entire document. So those are just kind of the way that we can think about it. But let's talk about this for a quick second. There are going to be some problems if you're using PDFs and you can't edit the source. So in that case, your options are to add alt text below it and then do the second version, that text only accessible version of the PDF that you can create within AI so that you have two versions. You can also ask the AI to give you all of the, in other words, rip the information from the PDF and then remake it as a Word document that will allow you to manipulate whatever isn't correct. So those are just some workarounds. They're better than nothing, and they are appropriate in situations where you cannot genuinely access the source file and you may have trouble recreating it. But anything you're creating new or you can edit, you want to make sure that you use the equation editor. So here's your little reference card. So it's one of it's kind of just a way for you to think about things. And then I'm going to show you how to do the PDF as an export in Word and PowerPoint. So make sure you have these things. And if you want it saved as a PDF, you can do that. But I will also tell you that there is a way, if you are worried that a student is going to manipulate your Word document, you can lock down that document so that it is a view-only file that they can't download it. But again, it depends on what you want, what your main goal is that you're providing them with this resource. So I'm going to pop back over to Word and quickly show you make sure when you're doing this. So before I would ever do anything, I would have run the accessibility checker, but then I'm going to go to File. The first thing I'm going to do is make sure that there is a title in that title box that you see highlighted on your screen. That title box is metadata. It is not the title that is on the page. Microsoft does not add a title for you anywhere. You must add it in the metadata yourself. So once you put a title in, then you're going to go to Save As. You are not going to use Save As Adobe PDF. That will strip your tags and make your document inaccessible. So we're going to put a file name in here and call it whatever. And then I'm going to click on PDF. Now, I already know that my options are set correctly, so I could go ahead and click Save. But if I haven't checked them, I'm going to go ahead and click Browse, and I'm going to see this window. This window is key because here again, there's no title in that box. And now my options, this is what I told you I've already checked. I already know mine are correct. It's this document structure tags for accessibility box is checked. So once I've done that, I could click this and then save it. And now I know that I have an accessible PDF. All right, so just to kind of wrap up. So never paste a screenshot of an equation when an equation editor is available, unless you're going to provide a text-only version, but you still have to put alt text in for that screenshot. If you need a written explanation, of what the equation means. Make sure you can use generative AI to help you do that. You Do It Advantage will flag equation images, and it'll also help you fix other things that may be wrong in your course or bring your attention to anything, such as your Word document may not have a title. Keep notation consistent. So whatever you choose to do, however you choose to have your workflow, make sure that you keep it consistent throughout your course. And if you do the two-part thing where you have the written image and handwritten notes, and then you have a text-only version, you are really providing that +1, which is universal design for learning, which is a best practice for all students. So the one thing that I want you to leave is make sure that you audit one course, and you also make sure anything that is in your course that you're not using, just delete it. If you have documents that you're not sure about whether or not you're going to use them, delete them. You can always go back to a previous Canvas course and pick them up later and then make them accessible. Stick with what you know you're using right now and make that piece accessible, and delete anything that you're not using. This is going to improve your You Do It score, as well as it's going to make your workflow and your course a lot cleaner and load a lot faster for your students. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a link to this presentation, and I'm going to put this in the chat.
We will also email it to you when we do the Tech Tip Tuesday next week. You'll have the recording and the slides. Can I ask Marion and James to stay on when Paige is completed? We're going to answer their questions, but pay attention to the resources here.
Yep. And so the last two things I'm going to give you, there is an entire website, if you aren't familiar with it, that you can go to that has anything and everything accessible. Actually, there are two. That's one of them. And then I want to bring your attention to, let me get the right screen. There's a few things. If you are trying to fix something, you can look at the quick guides. And if you, again, are looking specifically for things like PDF, alt text, if you want to look for tools, there is an entire Google Drive resource library that talks about PDFs and forms and specialized content.
Please, on that page, scroll down to 3 where they see where the AI prompts are, right in that window you're in.
Yep. And here are your AI prompt libraries that you can look at. There's PDF remediation. There's images to accessible HTML for Canvas, which is very similar to what I showed you earlier. I also want to bring your attention to the, where'd it go? Oh, here, STEM Accessibility Toolkit. You might want to take a look at that. There's going to be lots of different information in there. All these links are clickable. Again, they are found in the tools and resources. If you want to look for more things, there's an entire little module here that talks about mathematical content, bad examples, and there's also more AI prompts here that will help you when you're using generative AI. And with that, that is the end. I have given you all of the things and resources. So if you have any questions, my contact information is pdurham@vccs.edu. I also have open office hours tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday this week. Please feel free to stop in. And again, you can find those by going to my website, go to Get Help, and it's right here. So these are all of the hours through June. So when you start working on that summer course, I will still be available to help you. And that's all.
Please always double check the office hours, because sometimes we steal an hour to do a webinar like this. So double check just before you go into it.
Yep. All right. And that's all I have.
Okay, I have, if James and Marion could stay on. James is asking about electrical equations. So in the electrical equations, he has like V/R equals 1. So the V/R, how do we get it to read it as V divided by R? Because they're variable names, the
Do you
V
want
and
to
the
stop the
R.
recording?
I'm sorry. Yes. Potentially.